The notebook has 83 pages. I know because I counted them once, on a delayed transit somewhere between stations, when I had nothing else to do and the person next to me was asleep and I didn't want to wake them by opening my bag for a book. 83 pages, one sentence per day, started 7 years ago when a therapist I saw exactly twice suggested I try journaling, and I told her I didn't have enough feelings for a full journal, but I could probably manage one sentence. She didn't find that funny. I still think it was reasonable. The last page is blank. Has been for about 3 weeks. I keep meaning to fill it, and then not filling it, which is unlike me. I'm not a person who leaves things unfinished. I've been telling myself it's because nothing worth writing has happened lately. That's probably not entirely true. I was on my 4th coffee of the morning when the message came through. Official header, diplomatic seal, the kind of formatting that means someone spent time making it look important. The content was simple. My name had been identified as the only registered specialist in pre-imperial Valian linguistic forms, and my presence was requested at the interspecies convocation on Marin Station in 12 days. I knew about Valian. I'd spent 7 years on their language, specifically the archival dialect used in texts predating the current empire by about 4 centuries. It's a dead language in the sense that nobody speaks it conversationally anymore, though the modern form is descended from it the way modern languages descend from things nobody remembers how to pronounce correctly. What the message didn't explain was why the Valian Empire needed a human to read their own ancestral language. I found out when I arrived. The empress wanted to meet me personally. I remember thinking, as I stood outside the convocation hall waiting to be announced, that I hadn't ironed my jacket, and I probably should have. The hall was larger than it needed to be, which is true of most official spaces. There's a theory that governments build large rooms to make individuals feel small, and standing in the entrance to the Valian convocation chamber, I was prepared to accept that theory as fact. The ceiling was high enough that the lighting at the top of it looked like distant stars, which was either intentional symbolism or very good engineering. Possibly both. I was announced by a functionary whose job appeared to consist entirely of saying names in a voice that suggested the name should mean something to everyone present. Mine clearly didn't. There was a brief pause in the ambient noise of the chamber, the kind of pause that means people are trying to remember if they should know who this is, and then it resumed. The empress was at the far end of the room. I knew it was her before anyone pointed her out, which sounds more dramatic than it was. She was simply the person that the room was arranged around, the fixed point that everything else oriented toward. She was speaking to someone when I entered and she didn't look up immediately, which I found unexpectedly relaxing. Being looked at by an entire room is one thing. Being looked at by one specific person who has clearly already decided something about you is another. She looked up when I was about halfway across the room. I kept walking at the same pace. Speeding up would have looked nervous. Slowing down would have looked deliberate. I've found that in most situations the safest thing to do is continue doing what you were already doing. Her skin was the color that Valian texts described as the hour before the second dawn. I'd always assumed that was poetic exaggeration, but it was actually a reasonable description, a kind of warm silver that shifted in the light. Her eyes were a yellow gold that I recognized from the illuminated manuscripts I'd spent 3 years cataloging. The artists had been accurate. She was taller than I'd expected and looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has been given information about a person and is now in the process of comparing that information against the actual person and finding the comparison interesting. "You're the linguist," she said. In Standard, not Valian, which told me she was being deliberately accessible. "Yes," I said. "You read the founding texts." "Most of them." The 4th volume has a water damage issue that makes the middle section difficult. Something shifted in her expression, not quite amusement, more like she'd filed a piece of information in a category she hadn't expected to use. "You've seen the physical documents." "Facsimiles. The originals are in your Imperial Archive." "Yes," she said. "They are." A pause. "I'm told you are available for a permanent appointment." I'd been briefed on this. The diplomatic contact who'd arranged my travel had mentioned, in the careful way people mention things they expect you to agree to, that the empress was interested in establishing a formal linguistic consultancy position. Permanent residence at the Valline court, full archive access, compensation described as significant, which in diplomatic language means they hadn't named a number because the number was large enough to seem like a negotiating tactic. "I'm a freelancer," I said. "I work project by project." She looked at me the way someone looks when they've heard a word they know but used in a context they didn't expect. "This would be a significant project. I have commitments," I said. Which was true, though the commitments were modest. 2 documentation projects and a translation backlog that I could finish in 3 months if I stopped taking breaks to read things that weren't the work. "Your commitments could be reassigned," she said. "I'd rather finish them myself." The pause this time was longer. We were talking about employment terms. We were also, I realized, talking about something slightly different. She was trying to determine whether I was negotiating or actually saying no, and I was actually saying no, and she hadn't encountered that particular situation before and wasn't sure what category to put it in. "You'll remain for the duration of the convocation," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "That was the arrangement, yes. Then we'll speak again." She turned back to the person she'd been talking to when I arrived, which was a clear and graceful dismissal, and I walked back across the large room and found a chair near the wall and sat in it, and thought about the fact that I'd just declined an offer that would have solved every financial problem I'd had for the last 4 years. I still thought it was the right call. I just wasn't entirely sure why. The convocation session started the next morning. I was assigned to a working group on archival documentation, 4 delegates, 2 translators besides me, and a Valiant archivist named Tezcel who was approximately 300 years old and had opinions about facsimile reproduction quality that he was not shy about sharing. I liked him immediately. My job was straightforward. When pre-imperial Valiant texts were referenced in discussion, I provided translation and context. It was good work. The kind that requires enough attention to keep you interested but not so much that you can't also notice what else is happening in the room. What was happening in the room, on the second day, was that the Empress attended our working group's session. Unannounced. She sat at the back and listened, and nobody appeared to find this unusual except me, which told me it was probably a regular occurrence. She didn't speak during the session. When we broke for the midday interval, I found myself standing near the window with a cup of something that was in the general category of tea, watching the station's transit lanes outside, and I heard her voice just behind me. "The passage you translated this morning," she said. "From the third accord." "Yes. The standard translation renders the key term as sovereignty." "The standard translation is technically correct but contextually misleading," I said. "The term in pre-imperial Valian has a dual meaning. It covers both sovereignty in the political sense and something closer to self-possession in the personal sense. The scribe who wrote that passage used it deliberately. The accord wasn't just about territorial rights. It was about the right to remain entirely yourself." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a transport ship moved slowly through the transit lane. "Most people don't notice that," she said. "Most people aren't reading the pre-imperial form," I said. "The nuance got flattened in the modernization." "Do you think that was intentional?" I considered the question. "I think it was convenient," I said. "Which is different from intentional but produces the same result." She made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. "Then, you brought a notebook." I looked down. I'd been holding it. I'd taken it out at some point during the session without thinking, the way you reach for something familiar when you're concentrating on something else. "Yes," I said. "What do you write in it?" "1 sentence a day." She looked at the notebook. Then at me. "Just one?" "Just one." "What was today's?" I looked at the notebook. I hadn't written it yet. I usually did it in the evening, after I'd had time to figure out which sentence the day had actually been about. "I don't know yet," I said. "I haven't decided." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not the evaluating look from yesterday. Something more like recognition, though I couldn't have said what she recognized. She went back to her seat before the session resumed and didn't speak to me again that day. But twice, when I looked up from my notes, she was already looking at the notebook on the table in front of me. The second offer came on the fourth day. I found out about it the way I find out about most things. Someone told me directly, without ceremony, in a context where I hadn't expected it. Tezel, the archivist, mentioned it while we were reviewing a damaged text during the lunch interval. He said it the way you say something you assume the other person already knows. The Empress has expanded the consultancy offer. Full archive access. Permanent research rights. Your own quarters in the secondary residence. I put down the page I was holding. When did this happen? This morning, I'm told. He didn't look up from the text. The original offer was a position. This is something closer to a research appointment. Different structure. Did she tell you to mention it to me? He looked up then. She told her aide to send you a formal notification. I'm mentioning it because the formal notification is probably written in the kind of language that makes everything sound like a legal document, and I thought a direct summary might be more useful. I appreciated that. I also noted that he'd chosen to deliver the summary in a context where I was sitting down and occupied with something else, which is the technique you use when you want someone to receive information without having time to prepare a reaction. I'm going to decline, I said. Tezel looked at me for a moment. The archive, he said, contains approximately 14,000 documents in pre-Imperial Valian. Fewer than 60 have been formally translated. Most of those translations are incomplete. I know. You've spent 7 years working from facsimiles of 12 of them. I know that too. He went back to the text. I'm just providing context, he said. Not a recommendation. I went back to the text as well. The damage on this particular page was in the upper left corner, which meant the beginning of each line was missing and I was reconstructing meaning from what remained, which is a specific kind of problem that requires a specific kind of attention. I gave it that attention for about 10 minutes before I admitted to myself that I was using the work to avoid thinking about the offer, which is a habit I have and don't particularly like about myself. 14,000 documents. I'd known the archive was large, but I hadn't known the number. I declined anyway. Sent a formal response through the diplomatic channel that same afternoon, polite and clear. I gave no reason because I didn't have a reason I could articulate cleanly, and giving a vague reason is worse than giving none. That evening I wrote my sentence for the day. Asterisk, the things you want most are the ones you have to be most careful about wanting. Asterisk. I looked at it for a while after I wrote it. Then I closed the notebook. The session on the 5th day was the one where the translation incident happened. The delegate in question was from a mid-tier system called Orvan, and he'd been present in the working group since the first day without saying much. I noticed him the way you notice someone who is very still in a room where other people are moving, not because stillness is suspicious but because it's unusual enough to register. He had a translator of his own, a young woman who looked tired in the way people look when they've been correcting someone's mistakes for a long time and aren't allowed to say so directly. The incident happened during a discussion of territorial boundary documentation. Someone referenced a pre-Imperial Valian clause about sovereignty rights, the same term I'd explained to the Empress 2 days earlier, and the Orvan delegate's translator rendered it as territorial dominance, in standard. It's not a neutral mistranslation. Territorial dominance implies an aggressive claim. Self-possession and its related meanings imply something much more limited and internal. The difference in context was the difference between a statement that could be read as a provocation and a statement that was simply a record of existing rights. I heard it happen. I wrote a note to myself in the margin of my working document, asterisk incorrect, see third accord contextual analysis. Asterisk, I looked at the note. I looked at the Valian delegation across the table, 2 of whom had gone very still in the way people go still when they've heard something that requires a response but haven't decided what response to give. I should have passed the note to the session chair and let the formal correction process handle it. That's the correct procedure. The session chair would have flagged it, the translations would have been reviewed, the record would have been amended. The session chair was on the other side of the room, and the Valiant delegates were already beginning to formulate a response that was going to make the next 10 minutes significantly more complicated. I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, in Standard, and then I said it again in formal Valiant because that was the language the clause had been quoted in, and the correction needed to happen in the same register. "The term rendered as territorial dominance in that passage is a pre-imperial compound that carries a dual meaning. The correct translation in this context is the right of self-possession, a statement about the preservation of internal sovereignty, not external claim. The distinction is significant and the record should reflect it." The room was quiet. The Orvan delegate looked at me with an expression that was not warm. I sat back down. The session chair handled the formal correction efficiently. The record was amended. The Valiant delegates relaxed by approximately 2 degrees, which in diplomatic terms is a significant change. The session continued. Afterward, in the corridor, the Orvan delegate walked past me without speaking, but with a quality of not speaking that communicated something clearly. His translator, walking slightly behind him, caught my eye for half a second and gave me a look that I interpreted as *, "Thank you for doing that, and I'm sorry about what comes next." *. What came next, I found out 2 hours later, was a formal complaint. Procedural interference, the complaint said. Unsanctioned intervention in an official translation process. The language was precise and the implications were serious. If the complaint was upheld, it would go on my professional record and would affect my ability to work at events like this one in the future. I sat in my assigned quarters and read the complaint document 3 times. It was well written, which made it worse. Vague complaints are easy to dismiss. Specific, well-structured complaints require specific, well-structured responses. I started writing mine. I was on the second draft when there was a knock at the door. I opened it expecting the diplomatic liaison who'd been assigned to assist me with administrative matters. It was the Empress. She was alone, or nearly alone. There were 2 guards at the far end of the corridor who were doing a practiced impression of not being there. She was not in formal dress. She looked, more than she had at any point in the previous 4 days, like a person rather than a position. "You've seen the complaint," she said. "I'm responding to it. I can have it dismissed," she said. "One conversation with the appropriate officials. It would be resolved by morning." I looked at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because the translation was incorrect and you were right to correct it." A pause. "And because the complaint is a retaliation and everyone knows it." "I appreciate that," I said. "I'd rather handle it myself." She looked at the document on my desk. Then at me. "You're declining again." "I'm declining the assistance," I said. "Not the sentiment. We were talking about a complaint resolution. We were also talking about something else, and we both knew it, and neither of us said what it was." "You're going to be up all night," she said. "Probably," I said. "I've done it before." She stood in the doorway for a moment that was slightly longer than a farewell requires. Then she said, "The notebook. Did you write today's sentence?" "Not yet," I said. "Still deciding what the day was about." She looked at me with that expression again, the one I'd seen twice before and still couldn't name precisely. Then she left, and I closed the door, and I went back to the complaint response, and I did not think about the expression on her face. I thought about it anyway. The complaint hearing was scheduled for the 7th day, which gave me 2 days to prepare a response that was accurate, well documented, and didn't make me sound like someone who thought rules applied to everyone except him. I finished the second draft at around 2 in the morning and read it back and decided it was too defensive. A defensive response implies you believe you might be wrong. I didn't believe I was wrong. I rewrote it from the beginning with that in mind and finished the 3rd draft at 4, which was better, and went to sleep for 3 hours, which was not enough but was what was available. The 6 days' sessions were normal. I translated, took notes, drank too much of the station's version of coffee, which was slightly too bitter, and which I kept drinking anyway because the alternative was being tired and I'd already used up my tired allocation for the week. Tezel mentioned nothing about the complaint, which meant he either didn't know or had decided not to discuss it, and either way I appreciated it. The Empress did not attend the 6-day sessions. I noticed this the way you noticed the absence of something you hadn't admitted to expecting. The chair at the back of the room where she'd sat on the 2nd and 3rd days was occupied by a different official. The sessions ran exactly as they should have. Nothing was missing in any functional sense. I wrote my sentence that evening. Noticing an absence is its own kind of information. I looked at that for a while too. The 3rd offer came on the morning of the 7th day, 3 hours before the complaint hearing. It was delivered by her aide, a compact, efficient woman named Orvis who communicated primarily through precise statements and the occasional adjustment of expression that substituted for everything a less controlled person would have said out loud. She handed me a document and waited while I read it. It was not a job offer. It was not a research appointment. It was an offer of full and unrestricted access to the Valian Imperial Archive, permanent, transferable to any institution I chose to affiliate with no requirement of residence or service. Just the access. No strings described in the document, which meant either there were no strings or the strings were understood rather than stated. I read it twice. She's offering me the archive, I said. Without the position. Yes, Orvis said. Why? Orvis looked at me with the expression of someone who knows the answer and has been instructed not to give it directly. The Empress felt the previous offers may have been structured incorrectly. Incorrectly how? They asked you to come to the archive? Orvis said. This offer brings the archive to you. I put the document down on the desk. Outside the window the station's morning cycle was shifting the lighting toward its daytime setting, the slow brightening that was the closest thing to a sunrise you got on an orbital station. I'd been watching it happen every morning for 6 days and I still found it slightly unconvincing, like a very good imitation of something. Tell her I need to think about it, I said. Orvis nodded and left. I sat with the document for the remaining 3 hours before the hearing and thought about what it meant that she'd restructured the offer 3 times. The first offer had been a position. The second had been a research appointment. The third had removed everything except the thing I'd actually wanted. She'd been paying attention to what I didn't say, which is more difficult than paying attention to what people do say and requires a different kind of interest. I didn't let myself think too carefully about what kind of interest that was. The hearing was held in a small conference room with 4 officials, the Orvan delegate, his translator, me, and a session recorder. The Empress was not present. I hadn't expected her to be. Formal complaint proceedings don't involve parties who aren't directly named in the complaint, and her offer to resolve it the night before had been personal, not procedural. I presented my response. The Orvan delegate presented his position. The officials asked questions that were precise and fair. I answered them the same way. The hearing took 90 minutes. At the end, the senior official said the complaint was noted but that the review of the translation record supported the correction I had made and found it to be within the scope of a technical consultant's role. The complaint would not be upheld. The record would reflect the correction as valid. The Orvan delegate left without speaking. His translator, passing behind him, paused for exactly 1 second beside my chair and said, very quietly, "He did it on purpose. You should know that." Then she kept walking and was gone before I could respond. I sat in the empty conference room for a few minutes after everyone else had left. The chair the Orvan delegate had been sitting in was still slightly turned from when he'd pushed it back. The recorder's equipment was still on the table. Someone had left a cup of something at the far end that was probably cold by now. I thought about what the translator had said. I'd suspected it, a mistranslation that specific, in a context that sensitive, from a translator who clearly knew her work, didn't happen by accident. But suspecting something and having it confirmed are different things, and the confirmation made me tired in a way the hearing itself hadn't. I went back to my quarters. The document Orvis had brought was still on the desk. I picked it up and read it a third time, more slowly. The language was careful and the terms were genuinely what they appeared to be: access without obligation, permanent and transferable. For 7 years I'd been working from facsimiles of 12 documents. The archive held 14,000. I was still reading it when there was a knock at the door. I opened it. The Empress was there again, and again nearly alone, and again not in formal dress. She looked like she'd come directly from somewhere rather than prepared to come here, which was different from the previous visits, and I noticed it. "The hearing," she said. "Resolved," I said. "In my favor." "I know." A pause. "I followed the record." "You could have ended it faster," I said. "You didn't want me to." "No," I said. "I didn't." We looked at each other for a moment. "The offer," she said. "Have you thought about it?" "I'm thinking about it now." "What are you thinking?" I looked at the document in my hand. Then at her. "I'm thinking that you restructured it 3 times, I said. "The first time you offered me a role. The second time you offered me a home. The third time you offered me the thing I actually wanted without asking for anything in return." I paused. "I'm trying to understand what changed." She was quiet for long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. "The translation," she said finally. "What you said about the term. Self-possession. The right to remain entirely yourself." Another pause. I understood, after that, why the other offers didn't work. We were talking about an archive access agreement. We were completely talking about an archive access agreement. "I haven't decided yet," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm not here about the offer." I waited. "The notebook," she said. "Yesterday's sentence. What was it?" I looked at her. She looked back, steady and direct, and it was the first time since I'd arrived that she looked like she was asking something she genuinely didn't know the answer to. I went to the desk. Picked up the notebook. Found yesterday's page and held it out. She read it. Asterisk noticing an absence is its own kind of information. Asterisk. She looked up. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to control. "I didn't attend the sessions yesterday," she said. "I notice," I said. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Outside the window the station's lighting had settled into full daytime mode, the unconvincing brightness that I'd stopped finding unconvincing somewhere around day 3. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," I said. "About the offer." "All right," she said. She left. I closed the door. I stood in the middle of the room holding the notebook and thought about the expression on her face when she'd read the sentence, and I thought about 14,000 documents, and I thought about the fact that I was going to decline again, and I wasn't entirely sure anymore that I was right to. I wrote the next sentence before I went to sleep. I didn't show it to anyone. I declined the third offer on the morning of the 8th day. I sent the response through the formal channel before I'd had my first coffee, which is either evidence of conviction or evidence that I make worse decisions before caffeine. I've considered both possibilities and I'm not sure the answer matters. The decision was the same either way. The reason I gave this time was honest. I didn't want access to the archive as a gift. I'd spent 7 years earning the right to work with those texts through the slow, unglamorous process of becoming someone who understood them. Taking the access as something handed to me changed what it meant, and what it meant was most of why I wanted it. I wasn't sure she'd understand that. I sent the response anyway. The 8th day's sessions were the last full working day of the convocation. The following day was reserved for formal closings and diplomatic farewells, and the day after that everyone went home. I translated, took notes, drank the bitter coffee, exchanged what had become a comfortable working shorthand with Tessel, who had stopped explaining things to me as if I might not know them and started explaining things to me as if I would find them as interesting as he did. I did find them interesting. It was a good day's work. The Empress attended the morning session. She sat at the back. She didn't look at me any more than she looked at anyone else. which I noticed because I was paying attention to it, which told me something about myself that I filed away for later consideration. During the afternoon break, I was standing at the window again with the notebook out, not writing in it yet, just holding it. The last page was still blank. I'd been leaving it blank for nearly a month now, and the blankness had started to feel less like incompletion and more like waiting, which was a distinction I hadn't been able to articulate until approximately that moment. "You declined again." I didn't turn around. I'd heard her approach. She moved quietly but not silently, and I'd learned the particular quality of the room's atmosphere when she entered it. "Yes," I said. She came to stand beside me at the window. Not close enough to be a statement, not far enough to be a distance. The transit lanes outside were busy in the afternoon, more ships moving through than in the morning, the station's traffic pattern doing whatever station's traffic patterns do. "The reason you gave," she said. "About earning access." "Yes. I've been thinking about it." "What did you conclude?" "That you're right," she said. "And that I should have understood that earlier." A pause. "I've been offering you things." "I haven't been asking you what you want." "We were talking about archive access." "We were also, I was fairly certain, not only talking about archive access." "What would you ask?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a large transport moved slowly through the far lane. "What would make the work worth doing?" she said. "Not the access. The work itself. What would make it matter to you?" I thought about that seriously, because it was a serious question and she'd asked it seriously. "Collaboration," I said. "Not assistance, actual collaboration. Someone who knows the living language working alongside someone who knows the dead form. The text's read differently when you have both. You haven't had that. The facsimiles don't come with collaborators." "No," she said. "They don't?" Another pause. "I know the living language." I looked at her then. She was still looking out the window. "I know," I said. "I've heard you use the pre-imperial forms in formal address. Your pronunciation is archaic by current standards, which means you learn from old sources." "My grandmother," she said. She believed the modern form had lost precision. She was right. I said. There are 17 distinctions in the pre-imperial verb system that the modern form collapsed into 3. 22. She said. My grandmother was very thorough. I looked back out the window. 22. I said. I'll want to revisit my notes on the third accord. Something changed in the quality of the silence beside me. I couldn't have described it precisely. It was the kind of change that you feel before you hear it, the atmospheric shift of something relaxing that had been held. "The notebook," she said. "The last page. Still blank. What would it take?" I turned to look at her. She was looking at the notebook in my hand, not at me, which I suspected was deliberate, giving me room to answer without the pressure of being watched. "I don't know yet," I said. Which was honest. I know what the sentence needs to be worth. I haven't found it. What does it need to be worth? I thought about that for longer than was probably comfortable for either of us. Everything before it, I said finally. 82 days. 7 years. The facsimiles and the damaged texts and the 2 years I spent on a single verb form that turned out to be a scribal error. I paused. It needs to be the sentence that makes sense of the ones before it. Not a conclusion. A convergence. She was quiet for a long time. The transport in the far lane had moved out of view. New ships had taken its place. In pre-imperial Valian, she said carefully, the word for the last entry in a record has 2 meanings. The obvious one is ending. The less obvious one is the place where the threads become visible. I looked at her. I know, she said. I'm aware of how that sounds. How does it sound? I said. She turned to look at me then, directly, and the expression on her face was the one I'd been trying to name since the second day, the one I'd seen when she looked at the notebook, when she read the sentence, when she stood in my doorway at night. I had a name for it now. I'd had it for a day or two and hadn't used it because naming something changes it, and I'd wanted to be sure. It was recognition. Not of me specifically. Of something she'd thought she knew the shape of and was now seeing fully for the first time. Like something I wasn't expecting, she said. In a context where I'd stopped expecting things. We looked at each other for a moment that was longer than the break probably had left in it. I'm going home in 2 days, I said. I know, she said. The work I have to finish will take 3 months. I know that too. A pause. I looked at your project record. That's either reassuring or alarming, I said. Probably both, she said. And something in her voice shifted, not softer, just more direct, the door open without ceremony. I'm not offering you anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm standing at a window with you during a break in a session, and I've told you something about a word that I thought you'd find interesting. It was interesting, I said. Yes, she said. It was. The bell for the session resuming sounded in the corridor outside. Neither of us moved immediately, which was only a few seconds but felt like a considered choice. I'll be in the formal session tomorrow, she said. For the closing. I'll be there, I said. She went back to her seat. I stayed at the window for another 30 seconds, looking at the transit lanes, holding the notebook. The last page was still blank. I thought about the pre-imperial word for last entry. The place where the threads become visible. I went back to my seat. The afternoon session was good work. I didn't think about anything except the text until it was over. Then I thought about it. The closing ceremony was in the large hall again, which felt like a deliberate symmetry or just standard protocol. I'm never sure, with diplomatic events, how much of the structure is meaningful and how much is habit that got formalized somewhere along the way and nobody questioned afterward. I arrived early because I'm always early to things I'm uncertain about. It gives me time to find where I'm supposed to stand and adjust to the room before it fills with people. The hall looked different, empty than it had on the first day, smaller somehow, or maybe I just recalibrated what large meant after 9 days in it. Tezel found me near the documentation table and spent 20 minutes telling me about a pre-imperial text he'd located in the archive's secondary holdings that referenced a linguistic form I'd mentioned in passing during the 3rd day's session. He'd pulled it specifically because of that conversation. He had pages of notes. I read them while he talked and asked questions, and we got so absorbed in it that I almost missed the formal opening of the ceremony, which would have been professionally embarrassing but also, honestly, worth it. The text was significant. The empress arrived with the formal delegation and took her position at the front of the hall, and the ceremony proceeded in the way closing ceremonies proceed, speeches that are longer than necessary, formal acknowledgments, the careful diplomatic language that means different things to different listeners depending on what they need it to mean. I stood with the technical consultants group and translated when asked and watched the room. She spoke twice. Her standard was precise and her Valian was the archaic form her grandmother had taught her, and I heard the distinctions that the modern form had collapsed, 22 of them, just as she'd said, deployed without effort in the natural rhythm of formal address. Most people in the room heard a speech. I heard someone who'd been taught to preserve something most people had stopped thinking was worth preserving. I wrote a note in the margin of my working document, *22 distinctions confirmed. Grandmother's instruction thorough. Revisit third accord verb forms, likely more nuanced than current translation captures. Asterisk. Then I looked at what I'd written and thought about the fact that I was taking professional notes during a closing ceremony about a text I was going home in 2 days and had no official access to, and that this was probably evidence of something. The reception after the ceremony was the kind of event where everyone is talking to everyone and the actual conversations are happening in the pauses between the visible ones. I spoke to 3 delegates, 2 archivists, and Tezel again briefly. I ate something that was described as a traditional Valian preparation and which tasted like it had been made by someone who had read a description of the traditional preparation rather than eaten it, which is a specific kind of failure I have sympathy for. The Empress moved through the room the way she always did, the fixed point, the orienting center, and spoke to many people, and I was not one of them for the first half of the reception, which I noticed and told myself I wasn't noticing. Then she was beside me. Not in a way that required acknowledgement immediately. She was speaking to someone on her other side, and I was standing at the edge of a conversation that had just ended, and we were simply both in the same part of the room at the same time, which could have been coincidence except that I'd been in the same room with her for 9 days and I'd started to understand the difference between her coincidences and her choices. The person on her other side moved away. She turned slightly. "The ceremony," she said. "Well run," I said. The third speaker went long. "He always does." A pause. "You were taking notes." "Professional habit." "During the speeches." "Your address," I said. "The verb forms. There are 3 passages in the 4th accord I've been uncertain about. The water damage makes them difficult, and hearing you use the archaic forms in context answered 2 of them." She looked at me. "You solved translation problems during the closing ceremony." "I solved 2 of them," I said. "The third is still unclear." Something moved in her expression. Not amusement exactly, something warmer than that. "Which passage?" I told her. It was a specific clause in the 4th accord's 2nd section, a compound construction that the water damage had affected at a critical juncture. Without the full context, I'd been working with 3 possible interpretations and couldn't determine which was correct. She was quiet for a moment, not the considering whether to answer quiet, but the actually thinking quiet. "Say the fragment," she said. "What remains of it?" I said it. In the pre-imperial form, from memory, with the gap indicated. She was still for a moment. Then she said the full construction, not translated, not explained, just said it the way you say something you learned young and know without thinking about it. I heard the answer immediately. It was the 2nd interpretation, the one that changed the meaning of the clause from a territorial provision to a personal protection guarantee. 7 years of uncertainty, solved in 12 seconds in the middle of a diplomatic reception. "The 2nd interpretation," I said. "Yes," she said. "My grandmother used that construction to mean personal protection," I said. "Not territorial. The clause is about individuals, not borders." She looked at me. I looked at her. We were standing in a room full of people having visible conversations, and we were having a different one. "That changes the historical reading of the 4th accord significantly," I said. "I know," she said. "I've known since I was 12. I didn't know anyone else knew the construction well enough to understand what it meant." "I didn't," I said, "until 30 seconds ago." She held my gaze for a moment. "What will you do with it?" "Write it up properly," I said. "It'll take time. I need to cross-reference the related clauses, and the interpretation has implications for at least 3 other documents I've worked on." I paused. Ideally, I'd have access to the originals. The facsimiles of the 4th accord are particularly poor quality. We were talking about archival research methodology. We were having a conversation about something else entirely, and both of us knew it, and neither of us said so because saying so would change what it was. "There are 9 original documents directly relevant to the 4th accord," she said, "in the primary archive." "I know," I said. "I've read the catalog." "The catalog doesn't include the secondary holdings." "Tezel mentioned a text this morning," I said. "Pre-imperial, secondary holdings. There are approximately 300 texts in the secondary holdings that aren't in the public catalog." She paused. "I've read most of them. My grandmother's instruction was thorough." I looked at her. 300. Roughly. I thought about that. 14,000 documents in the main archive. 300 more in secondary holdings, uncatalogued, that she had personally read. 22 verb distinctions preserved through direct instruction. A 12-year-old learning construction forms that professional linguists had misread for decades. "Your grandmother," I said. "Was she a linguist?" "She was an empress," she said. who believed that losing precision in language was the first step toward losing precision in thought. A pause. She was also, I think, a linguist. She would have said the two were the same thing. She wasn't wrong, I said. The reception was thinning around us. People were beginning to leave in the gradual way people leave long events, not all at once, in a slow drain. Tezel caught my eye from across the room and raised a hand in farewell. I raised mine back. "Tomorrow is the departure day," she said. "Yes. Your transit is in the afternoon." I looked at her. "You checked my travel record again." "I checked it once," she said. I remembered it. We stood in the emptying room and I thought about the third accord and the fourth accord and 22 verb distinctions and 300 uncatalogued documents and a 12-year-old learning dead language forms from her grandmother, and I thought about 82 sentences in a notebook and one blank page, and I thought about the word for last entry and its two meanings. "The morning is free," I said, "before the transit." "Yes," she said, "it is. If you wanted to show me the secondary holdings catalog," I said, informally, "before I leave." She looked at me. The expression on her face was the one I'd named 2 days ago and was still learning the full shape of. "Informally," she said. "Just the catalog," I said. "To start." "To start," she said. Neither of us said anything else. The room continued to empty around us, and we stood in it, and outside the window the station's lighting was beginning its slow shift toward the evening cycle, the unconvincing imitation of a sunset that I had, at some point in the last 9 days, entirely stopped finding unconvincing. She was already there when I arrived. Not at the archive, at the window in the corridor outside it, the one that faced the transit lanes. She had a small book in her hands that she closed when she heard me coming. I didn't ask what it was. Some things you don't ask about before you've earned the right to know. The secondary holdings catalog took 2 hours. She knew where everything was without checking, which meant she'd spent time in that room that wasn't professional obligation. I didn't say that out loud. I wrote 3 pages of notes and identified 7 texts that would require me to completely revise sections of work I'd considered finished, which was either frustrating or the best thing that had happened in 7 years, depending on how you looked at it. We looked at it the same way. At some point we stopped looking at the catalog and started talking about the texts themselves, and at some point after that we stopped talking about the texts and were just talking, and I lost track of the time in the specific way you lose track of it when you're not watching for it to pass. My transit notification came through at noon. 2 hours. She walked with me back to my quarters. At the door I stopped and took out the notebook. Opened it to the last page. She watched me write. When I finished I held it out. She read it. Her expression changed in a way I won't try to describe because some things lose something in the translation. She handed the notebook back. Then she said, "I'm not asking you to stay." "I know," I said. "I'm asking you to take me with you." I looked at the sentence I'd written. Asterisk, the last page was never meant to be an ending. Asterisk. She was still watching me. I put the notebook in my bag. "My transit leaves in 2 hours," I said. "I know," she said. "I have one bag."